I was watching one of Gary's videos yesterday. I can't honestly remember which channel it was on. He's got so many bloody channels. I don't know how you do it, Gary. I had 2 channels for a while and I couldn't keep track of those. So how you manage with the 12 or 13 you've got, I don't know. But anyway, whichever channel it was on, it was this. You had this phrase in it. It wasn't the main subject of your video, I'm sorry, but this phrase in it, which I think you were quoting from Jericho movie, was something like, why did nature create consciousness? Was it, why did nature create consciousness? And I kind of know what you mean. I think I understand what was being said there, which is, you know, what was a viable evolutionary account for this thing we call consciousness? And, you know, obviously there's good answers for that. You know, if you understand consciousness as being some kind of self-reflexive, predictive mechanism that allows us to simulate various different futures, combined with a series of mechanisms for actioning on those futures, which it kind of is, then yeah, it makes perfect sense. It's a great survival trait to have to do that. But I think there's a couple of other things about that phrase which are also interesting. Why did nature create consciousness? The first is a bit of a qualm I have with it, a bit of a problem I have with it, because the way that sentence is phrased is kind of inherently theistic, or pantheistic at least, isn't it? Why did nature create consciousness? It gives this nature is the subject of that sentence, so it gives nature all kinds of agency. And I know I'm being pedantic perhaps, and it's just a figure of speech. And we kind of know that nature isn't doing the creating, it's just shorthand. But I think that kind of, I think it's called conceptual blending actually. But that kind of conceptual blending where you kind of compress lots of complex ideas into this sentence, and in that compression it turns into a personification. I think there's a difficulty there. I think that's the kind of thinking and talking which does lead to a kind of covert pantheism, or a covert theism even. Why did nature create this stuff? I think you're kind of reinforcing a brain pattern which supports the idea that nature has agency and intentions and thoughts, and has a kind of weird personality, you know. Wind's picking up. Anyhow, the other thing, that's in a sense a side issue. The other thing I was thinking about though was about that sentence, why did nature create consciousness? You know, if you take the agency away from nature and reverse the picture, then what you're left with is the sentence, why did consciousness create nature? And I think that's a much more interesting question actually. And not just why, but how did consciousness create nature, and what kind of nature does consciousness create? And what purpose does this creation of consciousness that we call nature serve? And how do we relate to it? And how do we relate amongst ourselves about it? Those kind of things. Because when we're talking about nature, we're not talking about everything in the universe, are we? I mean, implicitly we are, but really we're not. We're talking about the natural world that we walk around in. You know what I mean? That nature that's being referred to in that sentence isn't the nature of muons and quarks and bosons, and it's not the nature of redshift and you know, faster than light tachyons or whatever. It's not that stuff. It's this nature, this stuff here. Look, it's this, isn't it? This nature. You know, so consciousness is creating nature, and creating it in particular ways, in particular expectations out of it. And all kinds of entailments to that, you know, all this stuff about nature being in balance, for example, or nature being kind of nurturing or authoritarian, and you know, lots of the language around nature as a garden, or there's just lots of stuff around the idea of nature, which we're creating, which our consciousness has created, and which I don't think preceded us. Of course, you know, stuff preceded us, I guess. Preceded conscious faculties. But the way that we think about nature is completely driven by our consciousness, and by you know, what it is to be a human being, I think. You know, all the kind of categories that we break things down into, all of these different sights and smells and sounds and tastes and touches that nature brings to us. You know, or more formally, you know, the various parts and wholes that physics breaks down nature down into. I mean, that's nonsense, unless there's a kind of consciousness around to do that, to do those categorizations and to do those breakings down and to do all that. It's not like that, is it? Nature doesn't, it's a database, you know. It's just like a big access database. And then conscious comes along with its particular sort mechanisms and you know, and applies these search terms to the database, and this is what pops out at us. Look, wow, here we are in nature. And presumably if you put different search terms into the database, different kinds of nature pop out. Yeah. So I suppose all I'm saying is this thing we're calling nature, if we reverse that thing about nature creating consciousness, this thing that consciousness is creating that we call nature is essentially human nature. You know, the nature we walk around in, I think, is human nature and reflective of human nature and probably constitutive of human nature and providing the templates for human nature and the ground plan and the maps and the metaphors and all that kind of stuff that we think of as human nature. Yeah, that's what I think.